we've introduced Descartes and his peculiar kind of substance dualism. And Descartes is going to stand for us as the landmark rationalist so that we can recognize when we are leaning on rationalist assumptions and when our goals are rationalist in nature. Remember, rationalism is concerned with certainty, with distrust of the senses, with the justification of true knowledge. And it stands in opposition, and we'll try to draw this carefully, with empiricism, which focuses instead on the role of the senses and observation. Now, this debate is not about the nature of the world. This is prior to any discussion of the nature of the world and the knower. This is a metaphysical discussion. Metaphysical discussions arise not only in philosophy, in fact they blur the very lines between cosmology, philosophy, and religious philosophy. Metaphysics is ultimately concerned with what one assumes is real. Often this gets worked out in questions of what can be said to exist. Remember Descartes saying, I exist. And sometimes metaphysics then becomes what is also known as ontology, which means the study of the different kinds of things that exist. So Descartes gave us a metaphysical ontology with two kinds of substances, stuff that takes up space and stuff that thinks. As well as describing what's in the world, of course, we're also, as cognitive scientists, concerned with how we know this. That's a different branch of metaphysics called epistemology. Epistemology is concerned with what knowledge is and what the means to knowledge are. So in some respects, cognitive science is a scientific contribution to a philosophical or even metaphysical discussion. It is a form of practical epistemology. And because of that, it can't be blind to these somewhat abstract debates going on in metaphysics. Descartes has given us one opening salvo here with his res extensa and res cogitans. And this is a particular kind of dualism called substance dualism or Cartesian dualism. And we need to be careful because there are many kinds of dualisms that arise in philosophical argument. But Descartes didn't solve the question at all of how the mental stuff can interact with the physical stuff. He put them, as it were, in different realms, and he just pointed to his pineal gland as if that might be where they interacted. And in so doing, he was trying one way to think of how there could be mental stuff, experiences, emotions, feelings, hopes, ambitions, joys, desires, and physical stuff, rocks and wind and sea, and how they could interact. There are different ways that you can conceive of this. So Descartes' non-solution is shown down there on the left. They must interact some way, and he just pointed to his own head. That's a form of interactionism, and it doesn't really work. Another way to conceive of this, if you accept the premise that there's mental stuff and physical stuff, is to suggest that all causality, all causal relations, lie in the physical realm and will be described ultimately by physics. And that which is happening in the mental realm has no causal relation to what's actually going on at all. This is known as epiphenomenalism, and what it suggests is the rather unnerving idea that you're actually a hapless, witless spectator to stuff that's going on whose causal principles you can have no idea of. Your view of yourself as a rational, thinking, competent agent is thoroughly mistaken, and all you're doing is peering at stuff that's going on with it, where everything is caused purely physically. So that's a rather pessimistic position. Another way of doing this is famously adopted by a philosopher called Leibniz, is to assume that there's all the mental stuff going on, and there's all the physical stuff going on, and mental stuff seems to cause mental stuff. So I think and I want and I desire, and that has knock-on consequences, and the physical stuff trundles along, and glasses of water get drunk and dinner gets eaten, and there's all perfect harmony between the two, but there's no actual connection between the two because there's a third level. There's something outside of this two-system world which is keeping the two series of events in order. That, for Leibniz, is what God was. That's not available to us as a solution. It's a little bit desperate. It doesn't explain anything. But you can see that Descartes has set up a problem that's going to be quite difficult to get out of. There are more problems. So, one spectre that raises its ugly head at this point, if we side with Descartes and sit there thinking, the only thing I can be sure of is my own existence, and I'm going to build carefully out from that and maybe look at the contents of my own mind or something like this. Well, that's a form of subjectivism which raises a logical possibility, which no one is in favor of, but it's a logical possibility, which is that we can take his skepticism seriously and say, you could be the subject of a huge, big delusion. You could be absolutely uninformed as to your position in the world because you're being fed misleading information by some demon. And this has been developed in a couple of ways. The philosopher Hilary Putnam developed this as an idea of you could be... Now, Hilary Putnam was working with different assumptions from Descartes. He was assuming that the activity of the brain generates the mind. Descartes didn't assume that. He was assuming that the activity of the brain generates experience, shall we say. And furthermore, that the brain has inputs and outputs, which can be simulated on a computer, so that if you feed it just the right inputs and register its outputs and adjust the simulated world accordingly, you could actually be a brain in a vat, in a mad scientist laboratory somewhere, with computer signals coming in and being read on the way back out, and you would think you're running around in the fields. It's a harebrained thought experiment, but it was given flesh in the movie The Matrix, the first of the trilogy. The last two are not as good. The first one poses this question quite well. In that film, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend the first Matrix film, humans in a dystopian future are being farmed for some ill-defined bioenergy. And in order to grow these human bodies, they're kept in pods, and they have neural connectors going into their brains, feeding them signals and making them believe that they're living full, happy, healthy human lives running around in the year 1999. They are, of course, deluded, and as soon as you remove the neural connection, they wake up and realize the actual dystopian future they are living in. I presume most of you have seen this. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. It's a highly recommended movie. Now, Descartes' pure subjectivism and his skepticism opens the door to thinking that this might be a logical possibility. Some people see this and they go, wow, everything could be a simulation. Isn't that weird? I wonder how could you even tell if it's a simulation? That's not the point of this thought experiment. We can dig a little bit deeper here. It's not to say, gosh, what if it's all just an experiment, a simulation? Remember, Hilary Putnam and indeed the makers of The Matrix are treating the brain as an input-output device and as the entire generator of experience, and they're assuming that there is something to provide as input and something to record as output. It assumes that the phenomenal world of experience arises based on computational inputs. Now, we'll have a lot to say about computation later on, but for now we're not going to try and define it. Let's just call them electrical signals. And it assumes that input going into the brain would make a world appear, and you read the outputs in order to calculate the effects that the body would have had on the world. Oh yeah, if I move my hand towards the cup, I'm going to reach the cup and the cup is going to move. So we'd have to update the world model. So perception here is completely logically distinct from action. Perception arises as a result of inputs, and action arises as a result of decisions to move in the world. Now, all of those are deeply problematic. So the point of this thought experiment is not to say, wow, maybe it's all a simulation. It's to make you think seriously about what you needed to assume to make this any kind of a coherent belief. Now, I've said before that Descartes didn't solve the problem of having two different kinds of substances. Cartesian dualism or substance dualism is not a plausible account of the universe and our place in it. Unfortunately, we still struggle with this, though, and the problems that Descartes raised have not gone away, largely because we talk about ourselves in ways that simply make unreasonable assumptions about reality. We often find it convenient to talk as if there were a clean separation between the mental and the physical. So it's quite popular these days to complain about Descartes and deride his substance dualism, but we'll find shades of it throughout pretty much all scientific work in psychology today. And we'll meet a discipline known as psychophysics, which is almost drawn directly from a Cartesian dualist position. So these problems haven't gone away. It's rather interesting. Another thing to think of with regard to Descartes' peculiar move here, saying I am, I think, therefore I am, or I am, I exist, is to think, well, if supposing you're capable of thinking that, if that's the only thing you can be certain of, and then you start figuring out the world, doesn't it seem plausible that you could be the only thing that exists, the only conscious being in the world? After all, if it's your subjective reality, if the thinking subject is the only thing you can be sure of, then when you peer at someone else, maybe they're a robot or a replicant or an android. Now this unlikely metaphysical position that you're the only conscious being in the world, in the universe, is known as solipsism. Nobody thinks it's serious, but to even open the door logically to that is something of a problem. Now, some people never get over this problem, actually. They never figure out, well, I guess none of us have satisfactory answers to the degree to which we share a world. But it's easiest to think about solipsism on your own in a room. If you're on your own in a room and you're just imagining other people, then they are fictions, you're imagining them. But if you're actually in the company of other people, this solipsistic position seems perhaps much less plausible. So maybe the best antidote to solipsism is to go and talk to someone else. Now, the problems that we inherited from Descartes will be with us throughout this module. So in class, we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the world as Descartes saw it and how it differs from the world as we might see it today. We don't live in the 17th century, and it's not quite clear that we are asking the same questions or that we share the same purposes in inquiry as Descartes had. And to see that, it'll be necessary to give a little bit of thought to what Descartes' world was like.